And we are live. Hi everyone, thank you for joining this webinar on transfer pricing documentation and Coperitas. And we hope to inform you on some challenges we see in the market on this topic. My name is Michael Verhoeven. I'm a managing director at Quantera Global, and I support several clients with how they set up their transfer pricing documentation strategy, and how to make this an efficient process for them while maintaining the quality they desire.
And my name is Mike van Vuren, TP software specialist at Coperitas Software Solutions. And a couple of years ago, we started the development of a transfer pricing tool together with all the experts of Quantera Global. And we're pleased to inform you that we now have a stable client base and supporting a lot of multinationals, tax teams, but also intermediary firms, so TP professional firms with their transfer pricing compliance automation. And that's what we are going to talk about today. Isn't it, Michael?
Sure is, Mike. Thank you. The agenda, I think it speaks a bit for itself and is in line with what we have shared with you when you signed up.
Yeah, so we will walk through these step by step, and please leave the questions for the Q&A, so you can ask questions in the Q&A box on the right of your screen. And we'll try to answer those by the end of the webinar, and any unanswered questions will be answered by email afterwards. So thank you for that in advance.
Yep. So the context, I guess most of you are aware, but just to take one quick step back. So there's a sort of growing need for transfer pricing compliance. So that's mostly based on political pressure and international focus of tax authorities on multinational enterprises to make sure they pay their fair share. And also there are several initiatives that increase transparency. And I think if you would look back, like say 10 years ago, then most companies had perhaps one local file available, and they prepared all the local files based on a template. While nowadays you see that you don't really get away with that anymore, and you should have your compliance in order and also be audit ready. So
yeah, I think this is clear for the importance of transfer pricing in broader sense. And if we look into TP documentation, there's a three-tiered approach. Most of you most likely will know, but just to service everyone in this webinar, there are three types of TP documentation. So the first one is country by country reporting. It's more financial information related for the larger multinationals above the 750 million euros of group turnover. Then there's a master file to place your intercompany transactions in a global economic, legal, financial and tax context of the group. So there's one master file for the group. And there are local files, the third tier, that's mostly done per country or per entity to provide tax administrations with more detailed information regarding the material intercompany transactions of the respective entity or entities. And I think it's also good to know that although not all countries in the world have adopted this three-tiered approach, sometimes there's also a form-free documentation adopted in the local legislation. So if you draft a local file for those countries, you're always safe. But be aware if you don't, or you think you do not have the obligation, that there's form-free documentation could be applicable as well. Then a general misconception, what I experience from discussing with tax teams is that TP compliance and TP documentation, and very often those wordings are mixed up a bit. So TP documentation is part of TP compliance, but TP compliance is more broad in that sense. And I think if we look at this picture, we may find several challenges. I think deadline management is one of them, because TP compliance is such broad that multiple deadlines are applicable during the year. And I hear a lot of questions like, yeah, when are deadlines due for the different compliance aspects, and when to start with the TP compliance in general. And that depends on us on a couple of factors, which we will discuss later on. And to give a good example, I think country by country reporting is one of those. Most multinationals think about it in December, but then they experience that gathering the data, validating those financial data, and eventually filing the CBCR report takes up a lot of time, and that deadline is approaching by the end of the year. So more and more making it a process and starting earlier. Just like with the VAT and tax reporting, other compliances gives you more breathing space to fulfill this this compliance burden. I think it's also besides those process technical parts of handling deadlines, it's also good to zoom in on the quality of your compliance. So your compliance needs to be in line with your business, and that, let's say, the financials are in line with your TP policy. So it's not only what we often call it making paper and check the box, but it's also regarding the quality of your compliance. And keep in mind this puzzle, so to say, it gets larger every year. When we look at the DAC 7, which is fairly new, maybe pillar 1 and 2 are added in the future. So yeah, it's getting more and more. And, Michael, do you have a take on this one?
Yeah, so I think indeed, so the puzzle is now nicely included in each other. So I think that's also what Coperitas does, so that it's the title of our webinar may be a bit confusing in that sense, that we named it the transfer pricing documentation and Coperitas, but yeah, maybe you can answer that best, Mike. But do you feel that Coperitas just focuses on transfer pricing documentation, or would it also cover the other pieces of the puzzle, so to say?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Michael. Yeah, there was just a topic to be highlighted in that respect. But what we've did with the Coperitas software solution is made a software solution that is such flexible that it can also tackle other aspects of TP compliance. So you can create any type of document you would like. So if it's a TP policy, in the end, it's a document, so you can create it with Coperitas. And the puzzle also let's say, assumes that there's multiple connections of the same data. So it's also reusing of the same data. So it saves you a lot of time, let's say, in comparison with the old-fashioned way of handling all those compliance aspects. And the other thing is that what we envisioned is if you have one compliance software solution or one transfer pricing solution, which can cover it all, then you'll end up with one solution for the tax team as a whole. There are also several solutions in the market which cover, let's say, every individual puzzle piece on your screen, but then you'll end up with multiple software packages for only transfer pricing in that respect. So we've made a more of a broader software.
Thank you. Yeah, so also in my experience, I think it really helps that the tool is sort of flexible in that sense, or So for the listeners, when you envisage it a bit, so you have, for example, also the intercompany agreements, and you have, it works with text blocks, and you can use the text blocks in multiple files, and it also includes variables and stuff so that you mix it up a bit and use also create consistency where it's needed and possible.
Yeah, that's correct, and that's also the considerations we're going to talk about later on, I believe. Yeah.
Perfect. Then some developments. It relates a bit to the context we discussed earlier. So what we see in practice happening is that, for example, in Denmark, you should there's new legislation that you should file your transfer pricing documentation. In Belgium and Poland are, for example, transfer pricing forms that need to be filed. In Italy, I think for a lot of MNEs, the timestamp for penalty protection is about due. That relates back a bit to that you cannot sort of uphold your compliance with just having at the template and preparing everything in Word. So in that sense, what we also do with a lot of clients is that we have a sort of strategic meetings in which we discuss how do you go about your transfer pricing documentation. So there are local country requirements for which we prepare an overview. And it may vary, for example, for multinational, whether they meet certain thresholds and they have the requirement or they don't have the requirement. Then there are perhaps also for that multinational some critical countries which are larger or which are more likely to be scrutinized. And then it's also a sort of risk-based approach, whether you would opt for, say, an OECD approach, and that you just say, well, we have one template that we apply to all countries. Or pick perhaps a couple of countries where you say, well, these are, for example, in Italy, I want to have penalty protection, so I make a localized file. Or in some other jurisdictions, perhaps you also have a reason to localize. I think this is also always a sort of balancing act for the multinational, and I think decisions should be taken deliberately and also should be taken in the context of a process also going forward. So the more you localize, the more time you will be busy with first, of course, the localization itself, but then also the maintenance of that in upcoming years, as the master file and local file are both an annual requirement, as well as the transfer pricing forms that are applicable in some jurisdictions. So I think it really helps, and it's also a relatively small investment to sort of make that deliberate decision. And I think also if you, for example, would have to explain to your CFO, why do I make a certain choice for transfer pricing documentation, and he also likes to see that you, sort of weight of the pros and cons of the various approaches that are out there, and created one that suits your company and also perhaps takes into account some developments that you anticipate.
And I also think, Michael, that we see that a lot of companies want to take one step back to look how it's all arranged. So also what I see is interest in such brainstorm sessions are increasing. Just to, let's say, have more of a sparring session, how to improve it towards the future. And what we, from the automation point of view, mostly start with, is also what you mentioned, those local country requirements. As time is very scarce, I think that most multinationals feel the burden of updating all those, let's say, requirements every year. And what we do from more of a synergy view is that you can also outsource it, of course, and we do it for multiple multinationals, tracking those deadlines and local requirements. So it doesn't have to be very expensive. And that's why we also compile such overview, and usually it only costs 100 euros a country to get it tracked. So maybe we can do a nice offer as well for the participants. So if you would like to, let's see, receive an example of a couple of countries, maybe the countries we have shown you as examples, maybe just write a short email to qgacademy@quanteraglobal.com, and then we will send you a preview of that list. And maybe it's a good starting point for people to get, let's say, that step back and view what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think so. Developments, you have on the one hand, of course, the developments in the transfer pricing field, and on the other hand, you also have the transfer developments perhaps at the M&E itself. So we see, for example, with clients that are looking for being taken over, or have a massive growth strategy, that they want to have their affairs in order, and also want to be ready for example, in due diligence, or other aspects may come into play. And yeah, it's good to sort of have a sort of balanced decision in that respect, that you see what risk appetite suits you, and what benefits also some aspects may have.
Yeah, and I think nowadays with a lot of, let's say, fintech scale-ups, time flies by, and they triple the amount of turnover, and before they know it, all compliance aspects will come to them, and then it's always good to be prepared how to set up such process, and what to do and what not to do, of course. Maybe that also brings us to the common mistakes.
Yep. So 4 pictures here, and they sort of intertwine a bit as well. So the most important mistake I think you can make is that you don't tell the story, right? So of course, you can simply read what you have to include in your local file or in your master file, and simply describe the facts, and don't think have any further consideration. What we see happening in a lot of audits is that transfer pricing of tax authorities really look at the storyline and whether they understand it. And they can also be quite picky in, for example, if you have one sentence included that sort of reflects something that is not in line with your transfer pricing policy, then likely that sentence will be picked up, and basically you are 1-0 down in your audit. So that doesn't really help. And also you should have also reflect on the intertwinement between the various sections of the master file and the local file. So, for example, if you describe key value drivers as, for example, that the local market is very important, and that you have some aspects there that you highlight under the key value drivers, and then subsequently you would describe a principal structure in which our residual profit is allocated to the headquarter, then that sort of doesn't match up. This is sort of a simple example, but you have a lot of more sort of examples in between that wouldn't really help. And it's good to sort of have a review on your documentation to see whether that's the case in your situation. That's then also the red flag, of course. So as a TP professional, we often read, of course, transfer pricing documentation, and we sort of can immediately point out a couple of red flags usually, on which tax authorities can raise questions or start issues. And I guess that also brings us to the next 2 pictures. So If that happens, then usually you get into a sort of firefighting situation that you have to put out all the fires out because all tax authorities are raising questions to you, and you don't have a single storyline on which you sort of can answer all these questions. While on the other hand, if you would set your storyline very on a good quality and that in line with everything, and that it really matches the business, and that makes it also easier, of course, to tell the story and to bring everything to it. Then once you have that set up, then of course you have to keep in line with, discuss with the business whether all stays the same or whether there are some changes that you need updating. But then you can, with your sort of base documentation, you can sort of go forward and also be audit ready, because you have that quality setup. And also when you do that, it's also good, I think, to what we often also see as a sort of common mistake is that a lot of details are included in the transfer pricing documentation that are on the one hand not required. It doesn't really contribute to the storyline. It's just like sort of text out there, and it doesn't make it more clear or simple. And it takes each year, for each person that sort of has to review your documentation, it takes time. So I wouldn't say you have to sort of limit your documentation to the bare minimum, because also a tax authority has of course a lot of a lot less information than you. So also facts that sort of that help you explain your story in an appropriate way ensures that the tax authority understands you and keeps you away from the firefighting picture. But on the other hand, also, for example, numbers that you perhaps have included once that take you a lot of time to update because perhaps the business started reporting different figures, while you want to sort of maintain your previous documentation and the previous figures that you used. Well, sometimes it doesn't really have to be that difficult, and I think that's also one of the key messages here, that set it up correctly, make it simple, and make it a process.
Yeah, I think it's a clear story, Michael. And what I usually experience is that there are a lot of, so to say, check the box oriented tax teams. What is your experience to those?
Yeah, it is a bit mixed. So I think, of course, many different people that prepare documentation with different experience levels, and I think you should also respect that, of course, and it's the decision of the company who prepares the documentation, and everyone tries, of course, to do that, to do the utmost to make it as solid as possible. But you see a lot of heritage often that sort of documentation is rolled forward from many years ago, and it's sort of usually people add stuff to the documentation, but they don't delete stuff, because that's perhaps a bit more tricky in a way for people to do that, and that makes that the documentation sort of grows and grows and grows over the years, which also makes the burden to update it each year larger, and the chance that you include a sentence that are such a red flag are also increasing in that regard. So I think that's what we see quite a lot. And then on the other hand, you also see documentation that strictly checks the box and doesn't tell the story. So that also makes that you cannot expect from a tax authority to sort of understand your story if you don't tell it. So then they also start asking questions, of course, to get a better sense, and may also form their own opinion already before you have sort of explained yours, which makes it more difficult in an audit to take them first out of their own vision and to put them into yours. So yeah.
Yeah. So to summarize, it's sometimes better to let's say less is more in that sense, and it's always good to think before you start.
Yeah. So less is more is not necessarily true, because if it helps to build your story, and also I think when preparing the documentation for the first year or the first period that we perform, we always think about like, well, what sort of helps the storyline, and is this also something that is a bit irritating, so to say, for the client to update, or is it something that is sort of relatively timeless and just sort of supports it. So there's always a bit of a mix, and that also makes it, I think, difficult to say there's no one way that suits everyone. But what does, I think, suit everyone is that you first prepare one solid documentation package as a basis, and then with all those considerations in mind, and then roll that forward and make that consideration also on the previous slide on the risk-based approach, which countries to pay more attention to and which not.
Yeah, I think that's a clear story. Maybe that also brings us to the next slide, so more the risk-based approach, and I think we can give all the audience a practical tool in this sense. Maybe some tax teams already do it. Maybe others, to others, this is new. But with Coperitas in mind, I see, let's say, the following considerations resulting in a more of a TP calendar for 2022. So that's more of a schedule based on your risk appetite and abilities within your multinational, so within your tax team. So if you start on the right-hand side, the level of detail, I think if you want to make a TP calendar and you want to classify, let's say, deadlines, so you have 4 types of deadlines. When you have an actual filing, so we call it a hard deadline, you cannot miss. Maybe you have an obligation to have your transfer pricing documentation, but you do not have the obligation to file. But when the tax authorities request for your documentation, you have under 30 days. Then it depends on your organization whether that's viable or not to hand over the documentation within 30 days. Then you have the more loosened up deadline where you have more than 30 days. So sometimes you have 60 days. That should be enough to, let's say, finalize your documentation. And there's the 4th category where there's no deadline in the legislation, and there's no deadline given when the tax authorities request for it. But it states that you need to have your documentation. And
Mike, a question on this one.
Yeah.
So what I see also sometimes in practice is that companies sort of tend to focus on the deadline requirements.
Yeah.
While I think if you have a sort of proper system in place, that it doesn't take you a lot of effort to create local files for each entity. If you use a software solution and you have sort of a automated data system in that software solution. What are your thoughts in that respect on the deadline management part?
Yeah, I think what I experience is when people handling their TP compliance on the what I call the old-fashioned way with Word and Excel, then they're really focused on these hard deadlines, as you're also stating, Michael. And when you're working with a automation software which can, let's say, duplicate your local files over the countries based on the data which is incorporated in the tool, then it's, let's say, more or less a click of a button to generate a already base type of local file for such country. And then you'll see that most of the deadlines will be met, and that is more easy to just tackle all the local files at once than focusing on those deadlines and starting the process just, let's say, 4 weeks before the deadline. So I think the people gets more of an enabler with the software, where deadlines are more on the background. And I think that in the past, TP documentation was more seen as a project. So then it's very deadline focused when you do a project. When you make it a process, then you can, let's say, have a bit less focus to it, because you know it's going to happen. And that's also an enabler of the software.
Yeah, I think it also gives sort of peace of mind that you don't have to think about deadlines, but just make sure everything is arranged and don't have to think about it anymore, and just don't get in that firefighting situation that you are almost with the deadline and then have to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also think, just walk you through this 4 piece. When we go to the right side, level of detail, you can also, what you already stated, opt for, let's say, more of a high level approach, or when you decide to go in full detail because your risk appetite's requiring you to opt for penalty protection, for example. Those are choices you can make. The more high level you keep it, the more it's viable for automation, of course. Then you have the second step, resources. You need to make a distinction between outsourcing and insourcing. And this is mostly chosen between if there's time available within the organization, or if there are large budgets available to, let's say, outsource the compliance work. And I think what's mostly overlooked is knowledge. You can have the time of the world, but if there's no knowledge about the, let's say, transfer pricing technicalities in a TP document, then you still need to outsource a bit of the documentation. But when you have quite some knowledge in-house, you can perform the TP documentation process, of course, and then, let's say, do a final review. Those are the choices you can make. And finally, deadline management is also choosing a software package which supports you meeting those deadlines.
Yeah, and I think maybe on the knowledge part and the resources part, Mike, I think typically perhaps companies tend to think like, well, I have to outsource or insource, but I think also because as Quantera we are independent and we are a niche company, and we can sort of help the clients in the way that we think is most appropriate and also most fun to do, so to say. There I think you see a sort of development that companies also ask us for example, just to do a review in the first year, for example, or an incidental review, or just a couple of countries, and that you then sort of add the knowledge of us to those to that local file initially, and to that perhaps the selection of local files, and that you then sort of create a sort of optimum between obtaining the knowledge externally and making use of your resources internally as well. Maybe one.
And I also think, Michael, there's a efficiency there. If you let's say, one local file reviewed by a TP expert, and you use a software which also uses the same part of that local file to create the other local files, then you in the end have, with one review, also covered the other local files. So it could be very efficient as well.
Yeah, maybe one question also on the level of detail, Mike. So I think it's sort of common sense. The more detail, the more time you may have to spend on preparing the documentation. And sort of my own experience with Coperitas, I think the benefit of using that is also that you can sort of have, for example, for the local file Italy or for the local file Poland or whatever, you can sort of include a separate paragraph or a separate text block, and then all the remainder of the local file stays the same, but you just add that text block at once, and then also in the subsequent year it's still that text block is added, and perhaps you have to make some changes to it or not. But then I think also that is sort of relatively manageable and still perhaps less time consuming than you would initially think.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, you can also only let people experience that, I think. And that's also when you send out a local file to your local colleague, they want to read it all. And with a decent software solution, you can, let's say, let only review the parts you've added. So I think that's more efficient. Yeah. So thank you, Michael, for questioning this this overview. I think it gives more insight to the audience as well, and this is also a good starting point. If you tackle those 4 attention points, I think everyone should be able to set up their TP calendar for 2022 if you're not already done that. Maybe going to the considerations, why automation? There are a couple of things to consider. There are a lot of multinationals which outsource, let's say, TP documentation and compliance maintenance to local advisors. I've come across a couple of cases where multinationals paid double, let's say for benchmark studies or to update local files which were reviewed by local advisors. I think when you set up a decent automation tool, you can save on those local advisors. You can do more work in-house with the same amount of time you're currently spending. I also think that then you can spend your budget to TP reviews to the local advisors, so that's more value added work for you. So you're saving up on the copy paste work essentially. I also think that it frees up time to do other value added work because mostly I experience junior people working in the company almost full time on compliance. I think if you free up work or can free up time for them, they could also focus on other things to learn and let's say add more value to the company as a whole. And there's another thing, you prevent, let's say, also finger pointing. If you have a decentralized organization, what I usually see is that HQ is pointing towards the responsibilities of local to, let's say, draft the local file and maintain the local file, while the local people point fingers to HQ that they're responsible for TP compliance. So in the end, or there's a document which is not in line with the master file, which is usually made on the HQ level, or there's no document at all. And I think if you set up an automation tool, you can have documentation, let's say, to cover your global compliance to a certain level, which is in line with your risk appetite. And the latest consideration why to choose for automation is also less key dependency. To get back to that junior position, if you work, let's say, 2 or 3 years only drafting documentation and always the same documents, asking people for information, waiting, I think there's no fun in work anymore for them at a certain point, and they will leave the company with all the knowledge included about the TP documentation. So if you embed that process into a transfer pricing tool, you're less key dependent on those persons. And in the end, I also think it benefits that those people, let's say, have more fun in their work working with the automation software, because I think it's not of this time to work with Word and Excel only anymore. so people will stay at the company longer. Then to make the switch to Coperitas, what do we offer as a transfer pricing software solution? We've built a TP solution that's very flexible, and we did that in mind that you can, let's say, continue on the storyline you already have created. You can decide upon your own which information you would like to include and which you do not like to include. So there's not a standard format to deliver the information in. You decide, so you're a bit behind the steering wheel. Also, it's so flexible that it can also cover other parts of TP compliance. So if you look into DAC 6, CBCR, maybe also TP policies can be created with the documenter. It's more broad than only TP documentation, local files and master files, for which we see a lot of competitors do in the market. So it's more of a broader tool. Then we focused on a... yeah, please proceed.
You also see that people use it for very different use cases than transfer price.
Yeah, that's also one of the characteristics. It also embeds a legal platform in it. So what you usually see within an organization, you have silos, finance, legal, and tax. And our solution is also used within the legal and finance department. And even, let's say, just to give a practical example, you can also create, let's say, financial statements with it. If you already have the information in the tool for your transfer pricing purposes, it's just a combination of text and financial information, which combines it into, let's say, your text note. So those are examples. You can also use Coperitas in more broader setup. And that also makes it a sustainable solution, I think. If what we've already talked about, Michael, is that there's getting more and more to the TP compliance table, or the puzzle, so to say, and our solution is such flexible that you can tackle, let's say, any of those challenges. And I think it's sustainable when your company grows. More challenges comes around the corner, so you can tackle those as well with the same software solution. And the fourth one, I think it's very important to have a central professional work environment. What we usually see, finance and legal has very fancy software solutions and also very costly solutions. And I think it's a bit underwhelmed that tax has Microsoft Office in essence. And I think it could be a better investment for tax as well to get good solutions as well to support them, which also results in people staying within the company. And the last one, I think, which you can achieve with automation, if you free up time on your compliance, you can invest it in, let's say, obtaining more control. Also invest time in monitoring of your transfer pricing, let's say margins, or even take a step back to look into what you're currently working on and if that's the right way to go. So I think there are a lot of pros to it, and I think it's worth considering. Do you have anything to add, Michael, to this one?
Yeah, so more my personal experience is that it so where in the past, for example, if for a client I would have to prepare 20 local files, I would have to sort of review each local file page by page, because could be that the junior perhaps made a mistake in copying some changes or etc. So that was sort of time consuming and not the most fun work to do. While now when we use Coperitas, it's just that I sort of check the text blocks and sort of scan through it whether the text blocks are correct, but basically they always are, and then you don't have to check word by word whether everything is solid. And also the financials are uploaded automatically, so you can basically check the Excel sheet whether the financials are correct, and when they are uploaded automatically, then you don't have to do all the double checking anymore. So that saves a lot of time and also makes, I think, life more easy. So.
Yeah, and I think that's also a good one to highlight. And Coperitas is not only for the tax teams itself, it's also working at a transfer pricing professional. So if you want to gain a competitive advantage, then there's a solution for it as well. So time savings, and that also results in cost savings for your clients and focusing on the more value added work. Thank you. Then I have more of a funny picture. Try not to laugh at this one. I always get the question, when's the right timing to start, or is there a right timing? And this picture illustrates an issue I see during many conversations with tax teams. So assume that this card represents your compliance burden every year, and it needs to be towed by 1 or 2 people due to these square wheels, which represent Microsoft Word and Excel. It's very time consuming. And as long as you're with 2 people, it's fine. Maybe just fine. It's on the edge of being not fine at all, but okay. It gets there to the finish line. And when the front man leaves the company, the card gets stuck. So you're not strong enough to get that card to the finish line. So you know it's a risk, even though you also know that the card gets heavier and heavier every year, as we saw with the puzzle. And the thing I mostly experience is that there are a lot of excuses not to start with a automation project because people are busy. We've always done it this way, so we keep doing it this way. And nowadays, I know there are a lot of changes in the world, also with companies transforming ERP systems to, let's say, the cloud solutions. When looking, let's say, to SAP, S/4HANA, it all costs a lot of work. But I think the decision about TP automation does not have to take a lot of time of your team, and the choice for Coperitas also enables you to not have to wait for the ERP transformation, as an example. We've made it in such flexible way that when the ERP system changes, the connection with your ERP system changes with it. So you do not have to wait after the transformation, which could take up a couple of years for it to work, of course. And then also my message is, if you change nothing will change, of course, and don't wait, because the time will never be just right to make a change.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add here, Mike, I think also the hurdle in the implementation phase that takes a bit more time. I think also the cooperation between Coperitas and Quantera is nice in this example, because we have, of course, the people to take away that hurdle, and what we see often is that we document the first year for a company within Coperitas ourselves, and that they then start licensing Coperitas and perform it themselves, but then they have already all the documentation included in the software solution. And that is also what I sometimes hear back when I talk to people that, for example, decided on a different solution, that they decided on it, for example, a year ago, but then they are still not using it. That's of course a bit of a shame if you pay license fees and you don't at the time to use it. So.
Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, Michael, you're saying that changing these wheels from square to round is just as fast as the F1, if you're doing it throughout the year?
As the Formula One. Well,
yes. So
yeah,
you don't even notice it.
No, for a client, if and doesn't, because usually they already have documentation, so wouldn't have to take a lot of time from either the Coperitas employees or Quantera employees. So I think that it probably only saves them time. And then moving onwards, if you take a 3-year look, or then it also saves a lot of costs. So
yeah, great. Thank you. Maybe to do some business cases, we'll keep these short. So what I've seen at clients, the most common one, I think, is reduction in TP documentation efforts. I think the biggest achievement was for a company which is active in 40 countries, which handled their TP documentation in 3 months before they used the Coperitas tool. They did use a tool in the past, but it was more of a, let's say, collaboration tool in Word, where they still needed to, let's say, do a lot of input, do a lot of calculations with the financials. So there was no really automation to it. And we managed to automate the whole financial side of the documentation. And they only need to let it checked by the TP advisor. They stayed with their trusted advisor, and they nowadays complete it within 3 weeks. So I think it's a huge performance step up, and it also has to do with, let's say, the level of detail, of course, you want to achieve. I think in the second case, I've heard someone telling me a year ago, sorry, Mike, I have no time to implement the Coperitas software because I have no time, I have no internal resources regarding time of colleagues, so I'll outsource it to an advisor. And in the end, last month they came back. I asked them how it went, if they were happy, and he told me, no, I was not, because I felt like I get 10 times more the questions. I need to, let's say, source it from my own organization to get the information and then give it back to the advisor. So it costed a lot of time in the end. And Michael, I don't know, do you also experience that clients feel, let's say, more of a handover person between the company and you as an advisor?
Yeah, so what we usually do is that we also think along with the company, like what data is available and how they can sort of manage that process up front, instead of just asking them questions. I think that's not really helping them. Of course, some questions also need to be raised, but I think it helps to think out the process together with them and see what suits them. And also that's of course a balance between what data is available, how can it sort of be semi or automated to gather that data, what data is required for the documentation, what data is helpful, and and then you also see indeed also speak to sort of prospects. Let's say that they are really busy with sort of that they get questions from our local advisors, and then sort of have to then raise that question back to the local colleague they have, and then they are sort of have a function as middleman instead of being a tax professional. They tend to like that.
Yeah, I think the experiences are quite similar. And I truly believe in more of a joint solution where the advisory takes into account the situation of the multinational, and sometimes it takes a step back from, let's say, their ideal world, but then takes a further look into the company, how things work out, what's best for them, instead of what's best for the end document itself. And also that's a balancing act, of course. And then the third case, I think it's also more of a misconception. Most times where very, let's say, young companies, scale-ups, are very hesitant to step into automation software, because they think that if you do not have a, let's say, base case of TP documentation, that there's no efficiency to gain with transfer pricing software. And I think that's the beauty of, let's say, Coperitas, that it's such flexible. You can set up with a advisor an environment where you can directly create your TP documentation in the tool itself. So you do not need to, let's say, bounce forth and back a Word document, but you directly work into a software environment, which saves you on the implementation, of course. And then after, let's say, a couple of months, you're set up with your first set of documentation. And I think it's very efficient and effective to do it that way. And then you need just a pragmatic TP advisor, which is also very confident to work with software themselves. If there's nothing to add to this one, Michael, I think we need to proceed to the takeaways. Would you like to cover these?
Sure. Yeah, so as I think discussed, it would, I think, for everyone be good to have a sort of informed decision on your transfer pricing documentation approach. So we offer that, and we call it strategic sessions, but you can call it what you want. And depending on the resources and knowledge that you have internally, you can do that also yourself, of course. But I think it's good to make a deliberate decision on that, and also have a sort of fresh pair of eyes, perhaps, to that. And it can save you also a lot of time and cost later on. Consistency and storyline are key. So don't prepare paper, but make sure that the documentation that you prepare that supports your transfer pricing policy, and also that your financials are in line with your policy. Then when you do that, also think about efficiencies that you can create in the process. It's not going away, the TP documentation. It's an annual requirement, and probably the requirements only keep increasing. So yeah, it makes sense to make deliberate decisions on that as well. And then when you have done that, then you can also determine your roadmap, what has to come first, and which steps you can take. Perhaps you don't want to go from 0 to 100 in this year, but if you already know a vision where you want to be, then you can take that steps depending also on the developments within your company itself.
Yeah, and I also think the last one is sometimes overlooked. In my experience, most tax teams believe they need to go from 0 to 100 in a year. But I think what you've indicated, do it step by step. And that's also a thing I want to give the audience, is that when you're choosing for the Coperitas solution, you can start up small and then grow into the periods. And then, yeah, let's say expand over the countries and tackle the compliance burden bit by bit. So I think that's a good one as well. Then we have a short overview of the upcoming webinars hosted by Quantera Global from the QG Academy. For now, on April and May, on short term, there are 2 webinars on transfer pricing on financial transactions. I think still a hot topic. And in May, the benchmark studies, the do's, don'ts, and I also think a good one with the COVID situation. So I think it will be an interesting one. And then by the end of the year, 2 standard webinars are scheduled. Of course, there will be more webinars added to this one in between. So stay tuned and please follow our LinkedIn page where we also post those webinars. And if you're interested in, let's say, already registering for a webinar or keep up to date to get on the mailing list, please send an email to qgacademy@quanteraglobal.com, and then you'll receive all the invitations in your mailbox. That maybe brings us to the questions and answers, Michael.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think for those listening in, thank you very much for listening, and we will cover also now some questions that have come in. But for those who need to bounce, then thank you, and hope to stay in touch. Then maybe the first question, Mike, relates to the importance of the benefit test in the local report. Would you like to answer, or first thoughts, or shall I, or what?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So the benefit test, I think this links a bit back to the storyline. So the tax authorities should understand the benefit of services that are provided to them and which the local company paid for. I think especially with regard to head office service, this is a sort of hot topic. Tax authorities may claim, for example, that if you have a local HR division and there's a central HR department which also provides services to the local one, that there may be duplicative services. So it's something to be careful of, and also to perhaps either in your report, but also in thinking out your policy and being sort of audit ready when such a question comes. That you make sure that you can explain it properly, and that also indeed the local company had a benefit, especially, for example, with acquisitions that were just acquired. There's a bit of a sort of imbalance between mostly management spends a lot of time in the first year, for example, but on the other hand, the company likely also has a lot of head office costs of the previous organization before they were acquired. So that's something to look into in a bit more detail, and make sure that you can also substantiate items when a question arises.
I also see a question about pandemic considerations.
Yeah. So this is something I think last year we had quite some discussions on with companies. So, for example, when you have a retail chain of companies and you were closed because of COVID, and then it likely had an impact on your financials. And perhaps the group and also local entities came into losses. And then if you, for example, would have a limited risk distributor and you decided that in your initial policy that each limited risk distributor had to make a margin of, for example, 3% on turnover. Well, as a group, you are loss making, then apart from the loss, you also have a lot of cash tax that you have to pay that year. And then, I think also here again the storyline is quite important, and consistency and substantiation. So, for example, if the industry is loss making as a whole, it may be arm's length to renegotiate terms. And for example, in intercompany agreements, we usually include a section of force majeure. Pandemics are also usually included there, or you could read it inside such a clause. So you should, when you want to deviate from your original policy, you should agree with it and document it properly. So you don't run, because it's likely that questions will be raised on it. But then again, maybe we're at a risk, and also on the other hand, the headquarter or the residual company may also raise questions if you don't. As Quantera Global, we also obtained actually the first COVID APA in the Netherlands on this topic. So also, if you would like to know more detail about that and what's possible in that regard, then feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I think a clear explanation, and that also covers the last question, which was also about APAs. So I think we've handled all the questions, Michael.
Yep. Yeah, so thanks again for listening in. I think perhaps what we want to offer the audience is that can have a sort of what we discussed earlier on the strategic session. We want to offer that first hour call to discuss your situation for free. So you can reach out to Mike or myself to set that up. And also for Coperitas, you can also arrange a free demo of the tool to get a bit more into the specifics.
Yeah.
Yeah, please let us know if you have any other questions or would like to discuss further. Thank you very much.
So thank you all for listening, and hope to keep in touch. And
thank you.
all enjoy your day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.